Some choices don't roar in like a storm. They slip in quietly, hiding in the dirt behind your barn, waiting for a man like Abel Harkin to stumble upon them before sunrise burns the chill off the ground. Abel had worked this stretch of land for 7 years, without once finding another soul trespassing. He'd raised 3 stubborn mules from foals, fixed every fence post himself, and figured the world had forgotten his patch of earth. That changed the morning he followed a trail of blood to his old grain shed. The blood was fresh, still wet, and smeared across the dirt like someone had been dragged. 2 sets of footprints, small, bare, and one of them trailed heavy, like whoever left it was on the verge of collapsing. Abel stood at the door, hand on the latch, already knowing something was waiting that wouldn't let him walk away unchanged. What he didn't know was that before sundown, he'd lose everything he had, and that an army was already riding for the thing he'd just found. The hinges cried as he pushed the door open. Inside, huddled in the far corner like cornered animals, were 2 young women. Both wore tattered traditional dress, soaked in blood and dust. One older, barely standing, her hand clenched around a broken plank, like it was the only thing left in the world she could trust. The other, a girl, 16 maybe, ghostly pale beneath sun-darkened skin, her eyes wide and frantic, and bleeding. Bad. Abel lifted both hands slowly, backing up a step to show he wasn't a threat. "Easy now," he said, voice low. The older one barked something sharp in Apache and pulled her sister in closer. Abel spotted the wound on her shoulder, blood soaking through cloth, still dripping. Not a graze. That wound had gone deep. He swallowed. "Are you hurt?" It was obvious, but it was something. She understood him. He could see it in her eyes. But trust wouldn't come easy. The girl swayed, knees buckling. The older one caught her, gritting her teeth as the motion pulled at her own wound. They were on the edge, both of them. And still they wouldn't take help. Not yet. Then came the sound of horses, fast, many, coming in from the eastern ridge, same direction as the blood trail. Abel glanced at the women, their faces twisted, not with hope, but with panic. Whoever was coming, it wasn't help. It was what they were running from. The younger one sagged again. Abel saw her skin paling by the second. No color, no focus left in her eyes. She wouldn't last much longer. "You stay here," he said, calm and flat. "You die." He pointed to the back wall. A rotted plank had given way years ago, leaving a hole wide enough to crawl through. "You come now, you might live." The older one's jaw clenched tight. She was calculating. This man or the devils behind them? She nodded once. Abel moved fast. He pulled the loose board away, widened the hole. The younger girl could barely lift her head. Her sister tried to hold her up, but her bad shoulder gave out. Abel stepped forward. She flinched and raised the broken board like a weapon. He didn't budge. "I'm not touching you," he said, "but your sister won't make it without help." A long moment passed. Then she lowered the plank. Abel ducked under the girl's arm, her weight limp across his shoulder, barely breathing. They slipped through the wall just as boots hit the gravel outside. The ravine was 30 yards across, open ground. 30 yards that felt like a mile when carrying a half-dead girl. The older woman went first, limping but fast. Abel followed, half carrying the girl, listening to every sound behind him like it might be the last. They hit the slope hard, sliding down into the dry creek bed. Safe for now, but boxed in. The ravine ran east half a mile before opening out. That was their best shot, but on foot? With 2 wounded? No chance. The older woman looked at him, said something in her tongue. He didn't get the words, but the meaning was clear. "You got us this far. Now what?" Abel didn't have the answer. Not yet. But he knew what they needed. Something fast, something strong, something with hooves. And he had one thing that fit that bill. Dusty, the fastest damn mule in the territory. The third mule, Dusty, was 7 years old, broad-shouldered, fast-footed, and smarter than most men Abel had met. She was worth more than his cabin, tools, and winter hay combined. He'd planned to sell her come next month to keep the pantry stocked through the cold. But that plan vanished the second he heard a boot smash through the grain shed behind him. "They were here!" a voice shouted. "Blood trail runs right through. Check the back." Abel turned to the 2 women crouched in the ravine, then glanced toward his land, his barn, his corral, his everything. He made his decision without speaking. "If either of you can ride," he murmured, "I'll get you something to ride. But you stay here. Stay quiet." The older woman stared at him for a moment, eyes narrowed, testing him. Then she gave a short nod. Abel climbed the ravine wall fast, heart pounding, boots sliding in the dust. Up at the corral, 3 mules stood watching like they'd seen this all before. Only one mattered. Dusty. He vaulted the fence. The 2 work mules barely twitched. Dusty, though, she lifted her head, ears pricking forward, nostrils flaring. She knew. "Easy, girl," he whispered, grabbing her bridle. "I need you to trust me now." Behind him, the sound of smashing wood echoed. Furniture, crates. Someone was tearing his place apart. A voice barked again. "Find them. They didn't just vanish." Bridle in hand, Abel led Dusty to the rear fence bordering the ravine. He'd have to get her down the slope, then get both women on her back before the search widened. It was madness, but he was already in it. Then 3 men stepped out from behind the barn. Not neighbors, not ranchers. These men wore dust like armor and moved like they owned whatever they saw. The one in front bore a deep scar across his jaw, eyes gone hollow from too many choices made wrong. He spotted Abel with Dusty and started toward him. "Where you going with that mule?" he asked. "Water run," Abel replied, voice calm. "She needs a drink." The scarred man came closer. "We're looking for 2 Apache girls. Hurt, bleeding. You seen 'em?" "No." "You sure?" His tone sharpened. "Their trail runs straight to your place. And now here you are, walking your most valuable animal away from the barn. That don't strike you as odd?" Abel stopped, turned to face him. "What do you want with 2 wounded women?" The man smiled, thin, soulless. "That's none of your concern. Where are they?" "They're not here. You searched my shed. Found nothing. Now get off my land." The scarred man took a step forward, hand settling on the hilt of his blade. "I think you're lying. I think you're hiding something. And I think we need to take a closer look around." He glanced toward the shed again. Real close. Abel's fingers tightened on Dusty's reins. She felt it, shifted her weight, ears flattening. Then came a small sound, soft but fatal. A pebble rolled down the ravine wall. The scarred man turned toward the noise, eyes narrowing. Abel stepped into his path. "You're not welcome here." "Or what?" "Or nothing?" Abel said. He had no weapon, no help. Just a mule and a line he wouldn't let these men cross. The scarred man laughed and pushed past him. Abel did the only thing left. He swung up onto Dusty's bare back, no saddle, just rope and grit. He kicked her hard, driving her straight at the man, forcing him to leap aside. Then he spun her toward the ravine. The slope was steep. Dusty hesitated. He leaned low and whispered, "Go." She obeyed. They slid down together in a spray of dust and stone. At the bottom, Nita and JC waited, pressed against the canyon wall. Abel pulled Dusty to a stop beside them. No time for words. Nita moved quick, helping her sister up. Abel grabbed JC and hoisted her onto Dusty's back. Nita climbed behind, bracing both of them with one arm. It was too much weight for a long escape, but enough for a short burst of hope. "Go east," Abel said. "Follow the ravine. When it opens, head for the rock formations, 3 miles. Stay off the trails." Nita looked down at him. "What about you?" "I'll buy you time." Then Dusty Maris appeared on the ridge above, with 4 more behind him, all eyes locked on the fleeing women and the mule beneath them. Abel slapped Dusty's flank. "Go!" Dusty bolted, hooves pounding eastward, carrying 2 strangers toward freedom, and everything Abel Harkin had spent 7 years building. He stood and watched them vanish into the bend. Then he turned to face 5 men with no reason to let him live. But before anyone could move, a new sound rolled in from the north, low, rising, thunderous, hooves, dozens of them. The Apache had arrived. The scarred man dropped into the ravine first, eyes burning. "Where'd they go?" Abel raised his hands slowly. "East, down the ravine, maybe half a mile ahead." The man nodded to 2 of his men. "Run them down. I want them alive." Boots pounded into the creek bed. The scarred man stayed, watching Abel with the cold patience of something venomous, waiting to strike. "You just made a very expensive mistake," Dusty Maris growled. "They're people, not property." He laughed, deep and bitter. "You don't know a damn thing. Those girls were spoken for, promised to a buyer 3 territories over, worth more than your sorry life will ever touch, and you let 'em go on your best damn mule." A cold knot settled in Abel Harkin's stomach. These weren't ranchers with a grudge. These were slavers, men who sold lives like cattle, who tore children from homes and sent women to mines or mansions depending on the price. Abel had heard stories, but he'd never believed it was this organized, this cruel. "How'd you even find them?" he asked. "Bought 'em. From a crooked agent, 2 weeks ago. They ran. We tracked 'em. Been on their heels ever since." Dusty took a step closer, eyes like stone. "We don't lose merchandise, and we sure as hell don't let some dirt farmer with a rope and a mule screw it up." Behind Abel, the last 2 slavers dropped into the ravine. 5 total now, armed, focused, and the thundering sound of hooves was drawing closer. Abel could hear it, Apache riders coming fast. 2 minutes out, maybe less. Dusty heard it too, his jaw tightened. "Apache," he muttered. "Perfect," he glanced at his men. "We gotta move." But he didn't move. Instead, he pulled a blade from his belt, long and cruel, designed more for fear than finesse. "You cost me 2 high-dollar assets," he said. "Now you're gonna tell me exactly where they're headed. Or I'll bleed you out right here. Let the Apache find what's left." Abel backed up, spine pressed to the canyon wall. "I told you. They went east, down the ravine. That's all I know." "Liar!" The blade came up, and then the earth itself began to rumble. The sound of hooves turned into a wall of thunder. Dust rose at the mouth of the canyon like a storm rolling in. Riders poured through the gap, dozens of them, Apache warriors in formation, circling the ravine like it was a trap they'd been laying all day. Not one of them panicked. They moved like men who'd done this before. At the front, mounted tall, rode an older man in ceremonial garb. His headdress marked him as a leader. His face was weathered stone. His eyes, fire. He took everything in. The slavers, the blood trail, Abel standing alone. The slavers froze. You didn't run from Apache when you were outnumbered 20-1. You didn't breathe. The leader raised his hand. The riders halted. Only the sound of horses breathing filled the canyon. His gaze landed on Abel, held there, measured him like a judge with all the time in the world and no mercy in his bones. Then the man spoke. His voice cut across the silence like wind across open plains. "Where are my daughters?" Abel's throat went dry. Daughters. The girls he'd just sent riding east, Nita and Jacy, the ones on Dusty's back, the ones who now were 3 miles away and counting. And here was their father, a man with an army, a man who looked like he hadn't yet decided which part of Abel to leave intact. Dusty Maris tried to speak. "We were just—" The leader looked at him. That was all it took. Dusty shut up, took a step back. The leader's eyes returned to Abel. Every warrior remained still, bowstrings taut, faces unreadable, waiting to see if this man, this stranger, was going to live or bleed. Abel's mind raced. Lie, and they'd know. Tell the truth, and he might as well have kidnapped their daughters. But silence wasn't an option either. The leader's hand hovered near his weapon. "They went east," Abel said, voice calm, though his legs wanted to give out. "I gave them my mule so they could move faster." "You helped them?" "Yes." "Why?" "They were bleeding," Abel said simply, "and men were hunting them." He nodded towards the slavers. "These men!" Dusty stepped forward, desperate. "That's not true. They were stolen property. He interfered with legal transport." The leader looked at him again. Dusty's voice vanished like smoke. The leader turned back to Abel. "How were they hurt?" "The older girl, shoulder wound, deep. The younger one, worse. She could barely stand. Pale, dizzy, losing blood fast." His jaw tensed. "They were hiding in my grain shed. Maybe an hour ago. Hour and a half." The leader gave a command in Apache. 6 warriors rode east at once. No hesitation. Following Dusty's trail. Then he looked back at Abel. "You gave them your animal," the leader said slowly. "Your property, for strangers. They needed help." The leader studied him. Most men would have walked away, or worse. Then his eyes shifted to the 5 slavers. They had started to bunch up now, realizing this had taken a turn they weren't ready for. "You hunted my daughters." Dusty Maris tried again, weaker this time. "We had papers, legal claim." The leader raised one hand. Silence. All around the canyon, Apache warriors began dismounting. They moved slow, precise, forming a circle around the slavers, like a noose tightening. The leader looked back at them. "You took my daughters," he said. His voice was quiet, final, the weight of death behind every syllable. His voice dropped, quiet now, but somehow more terrifying that way. No shouting, no threats, just the cold, final truth. "You chased them through open land, drove them to bleed and hide in a stranger's shed." One of the slavers, Huck Dobbs, maybe, blurted, "We were just following orders. We didn't know they were important." Sani's face changed, just slightly. Ancient rage burned behind the stillness. "My daughters are not important because of who I am," he said. "They are important because they are human beings, because they are children, and children shouldn't have to run from men like you." He dismounted, passed the reins to a nearby warrior, then walked, slow and steady, toward the 5 slavers. Dusty Maris moved first, hand twitching toward the blade on his hip. 3 Apache bows lifted in an instant, arrows drawn before his fingers even grazed steel. Dusty froze, raising his hand slowly, palm out. Sani stopped just 5 feet from them, his voice like iron scraped raw. "You will tell me everything. Who sold them to you? Where were you taking them? Who else profits from this trade?" Silence. Then Dusty sneered. "We'll tell you nothing." Sani nodded, as if he expected that, maybe even hoped for it. "Then you'll stay right here. My warriors will make sure you don't leave, and when my daughters are found alive, we'll speak again. About what justice looks like." He turned to Abel. "You're coming with me. We're going to find my daughters. And you'd better pray they're alive, because if they're not—" He didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. 2 Apache warriors flanked Abel immediately. Not rough, not gentle, just unmovable, like stone that walked. Sani remounted. Abel stood in the middle of the ravine, slavers behind, warriors around, and judgment ahead. The sun had slipped past its peak. Shadows lengthened. Sani had said they must find the girls before sundown. And Abel didn't know if Dusty had gotten them far enough, if they'd stopped to rest, if JC had survived the ride. All he knew was what he'd done that morning, what it had cost, and that now the reckoning rode with him. He was given a borrowed horse. Warriors surrounded him like wolves with discipline, watching, waiting, not sure if he was prey or ally. Sani rode ahead, back straight, eyes scanning the land. Scouts returned every few minutes, speaking Apache. Sani listened, nodded, gave short commands, kept moving. After a mile, the ravine opened into a stretch of dry flats. Dusty's tracks were clear. 2 riders, the depth of the hoofprints giving them away. Abel saw it. So did Sani. The pace quickened. The rock formations loomed ahead, jagged like broken teeth in the desert. Then, movement. Someone stepped out between 2 boulders. It was Nita. She raised a hand to block the sun. Her shoulder was wrapped with torn dress cloth. Her eyes locked on the riders. Her body tensed to run. Then she saw the headdress, saw the man riding at the front, and everything inside her crumbled. The fierce stance vanished. All that remained was a daughter who'd run out of strength. She cried out, one word in Apache. "Father." Sani was off his horse before it stopped. He closed the distance in long strides. She met him halfway. They embraced, and her body shook. Not from fear, but from the kind of fragile relief that only comes when you realize you're going to live after all. He held her, spoke gently, like she was a child again. The fury that had hardened him earlier cracked open, revealing something older, more human. He checked her shoulder, asked questions. She answered through tears, pointing toward the rocks. JC. Sani turned to his men, barked orders. 3 warriors dismounted and rushed forward, pulling medicine, water, food from their packs. They moved into the rocks. Sani walked beside Nita, her leaning against him. Abel stayed mounted, until one of the warriors gestured. Not asked. Gestured. He dismounted and followed. Between 2 stones, in a hollow just wide enough for 2, JC lay still. Blankets cushioned her. Someone had cleaned the wounds, eased her breathing. She was unconscious, but alive. Sani knelt beside her, laid a hand on her forehead, whispered her name. JC. She didn't stir, but her breath was steady. The warriors moved around her, cleansing, bandaging, efficient. Sani didn't move, just stayed kneeling, hand over his youngest child's brow. Then finally he stood, faced Abel, his expression unreadable. "You did this," he said. "You gave them a chance to escape." Abel nodded. "I told them to head for the rocks. There's cover, a spring nearby." Sani's eyes narrowed. They would have died in that shed, or been taken again. Instead, they're alive. Because a stranger chose to help. At great cost. Abel had no words, just silence, and the weight of everything he'd just gambled, still hanging in the air. Sani stepped closer, his tone quieter now, which somehow made it more terrifying. They were bleeding, hunted, forced to hide in a stranger's shed like wounded animals. One of the slavers blurted out, "We were just following orders. We didn't know they were important." Sani's expression finally shifted into something old and cold as bone. "My daughters are not important because of who I am," he said. "They're important because they're human, because no child should ever have to run from men like you." He dismounted, handed the reins to a nearby warrior, and began walking towards the 5 slavers. Each step deliberate, heavy. Dusty Maris twitched toward his blade. 3 Apache warriors raised arrows before his fingers even touched the hilt. He froze. Hands up, breathing tight. Sani stopped 5 feet from them. "You will tell me everything. Who sold them to you? Where you were taking them? Every name, every link in this chain." He paused. "And if you lie, even once, I will know." Dusty didn't answer. None of them did. Sani nodded slightly, like he expected silence. "Then you'll stay right here. And when my daughters are found alive, we'll speak again. About what justice looks like for men who hunt children." He turned to Abel. "You're coming with me. We're going to find them. And if they're not alive—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. 2 warriors moved to Abel's side, not roughly, not kindly, just there, making it known. He had no choice. Sani mounted his horse again. Abel stood in the ravine, slavers bound behind him, Apache warriors watching every breath, and a future ahead he couldn't predict. The sun dipped lower, the day bleeding toward dusk. Sani had said they needed to find the girls before sunset. Abel didn't know if Dusty had gotten them far enough, if they'd had to stop, if JC had even survived the ride. All he knew was that the choice he'd made, giving up everything, was about to be tested. They rode east. Abel on a borrowed horse, boxed in by quiet warriors with sharp eyes. Sani rode ahead, posture unwavering, eyes scanning every line in the earth. Scouts came and went, speaking Apache. Sani nodded, gave orders, pushed forward. The ravine spilled onto a wide plain. Dusty's tracks were plain in the dirt. 2 riders, 1 mule. Sani saw it, spurred his horse faster. The rest followed. Abel's mount kept pace. He wasn't a prisoner, but he wasn't free either. They reached the jagged rocks, sharp, ancient formations rising like broken teeth. And there she was, Nita. She stepped into view, raising a hand against the sun, her dress torn, her shoulder wrapped with ripped cloth, still standing. When she saw them coming, her posture stiffened, ready to flee again, to fight if she had to. Then she saw Sani, and her stance broke. A single word left her mouth, raw and trembling. "Father." Sani was off his horse in an instant. He ran to her. She met him halfway. When they embraced, her whole frame trembled. Not with fear, but with the weight of surviving what she thought she wouldn't. He held her, spoke softly in Apache. His tone changed, softer than it had been all day, almost fragile. He checked her shoulder, asked questions. She pointed toward the rocks, where JC waited. Sani gave quick commands. 3 warriors dismounted, pulled supplies, water, salves, bandages from their packs. They hurried to the rocks. Sani walked beside Nita, her arm looped through his, leaning on him. Abel dismounted as instructed. Between 2 boulders, JC lay bundled in blankets. Someone had tended her. She was clean, breathing shallow but steady. Sani knelt beside her, touched her face gently. "JC," he whispered. She didn't wake, but she was alive. The warriors got to work, treating her wounds with practiced hands. Sani didn't move for a long while. Then he stood, turned to Abel. "You did this," he said. "You gave them a path. You sent them here." "I told them to go for the rocks," Abel answered. "It was cover. There's water nearby." Sani studied him for a moment. They would have died in that shed, or been taken again. Instead, they're alive, because of you. Abel didn't know how to respond. He just nodded once. Then, from behind the rocks, hoofbeats. Dusty trotted into view, still saddled, looking annoyed as ever for having been left. Nita held her lead rope. She brought the mule to Abel, speaking low in Apache. Her words were soft but strong. Sani translated. "She says your animal carried them when they had nothing left. Saved them when they couldn't run another step. She says, thank you isn't enough, but it's all she has." Abel took the rope. Ran a hand down Dusty's neck. The mule pressed her nose into his chest. Still his, still standing. He met Nita's eyes. "You take care of your sister now." Sani watched them. Something unreadable crossed his face. Maybe approval, maybe something deeper. "Tell me, Abel Harkin," he said. "What do you want in return?" Abel looked around. At the warriors, at the two sisters who almost died that morning. What did he want? Winter was coming. His barn was half destroyed. He had no money. Dusty was still alive, but he'd nearly lost everything. "Nothing," he said. "I don't want anything." Sani arched an eyebrow. "Nothing?" "You risk your life, give up your most valuable animal, face armed men, and you want nothing?" "I want your daughter safe, that's it." The silence that followed was heavy. Warriors exchanged glances. Nita watched him, face unreadable. Sani stepped closer. Most men expect reward, gratitude, recognition. "I expect you to take care of your family," Abel said, "and to make damn sure those men down in the ravine never do this again." Sani's jaw tightened. "They won't. My warriors have them secured. They will face justice, not just for what they did to my daughters, but for everyone they've stolen." Something dangerous sparked in his voice. Something final. Abel didn't feel sorry. He looked at the sky. Maybe 2 hours of daylight left. They'd made it. The girls were alive. Sani seemed to sense his thoughts. "You wonder if you're free to go." "I do. You may return to your land. Take your mule. Go back to your life." He paused. "But I ask one more thing." "What's that?" "Return to the ravine with us. Witness what happens to those men. Let them see your face, the one man who chose differently." Abel didn't want to see what Apache justice looked like, but he understood what Sani meant. This wasn't revenge. It was a message, a line drawn. He nodded. "I'll come." They rode back slower this time. No rush. 2 warriors stayed behind with JC. Nita rode beside her father, head resting on his shoulder. Abel rode beside them, Dusty's reins in hand. The light turned gold. Red. Beautiful. Deceiving. The kind of light that made blood and ruin look like something sacred. When they returned to the ravine, the 5 slavers were on their knees, hands bound, surrounded by a ring of warriors. Dusty Maris lifted his head as Sani returned, and saw Abel at his side. His face changed, not fear, something worse, understanding. They'd lost, fully, finally. Sani dismounted, stepped into the circle. "My daughters are alive," he said, voice cutting the stillness. "No thanks to you. They are wounded, but they will heal, and you will make certain no others suffer as they nearly did." Dusty opened his mouth. Sani silenced him with a gesture. "You will be taken to the territorial marshal. You will name every buyer, every handler, every corrupt official behind this, and if you refuse—" He didn't need to finish. One of the slavers cracked, poured out names, places, details, desperate. Dusty spat at him. Coward. Too late. The damage was done. The web unraveled. Sani listened, memorized, then turned to his warriors. Take them. Deliver their confessions. See that justice is served. Within minutes, the slavers were mounted, still bound, escorted by armed riders. Sani watched them go, then turned to Abel. This is what you helped prevent. My daughters, enslaved, sold, broken. You stopped that. Abel looked at the blood-stained ravine. I just gave them a mule. Sani shook his head. You gave them hope, in a world that rarely offers it. You saw. You acted. That is not small. The sun touched the horizon. The ravine emptied. The warriors were gone. Only the blood remained, drying in the dirt. Soon, there would be no sign anything had happened in that ravine, just another stretch of dust and silence on the frontier. But both men standing there knew better. You still refuse payment, Sani said. It wasn't quite a question. I've got my mule back, Abel Harkin replied. That's enough. Sani shook his head slowly. It is not. You risked everything. Your land, your future, your life. For strangers, there must be balance. Abel glanced at Dusty, standing nearby, calm as ever. The balance, Abel said quietly, is that your daughters are alive. That's what matters. Sani went silent for a beat. Then he reached into the pouch at his side and pulled something small from within. He stepped forward, opened his hand to reveal a carved stone, smooth, aged, etched with simple markings. This belonged to my grandfather, Sani said, and his grandfather before him. It marks the bearer as a friend to our people, one who may walk safely across our lands, one we trust. Abel stared at the stone. That's too valuable. Value, Sani said, is what something represents. This stone represents debt paid, honor acknowledged. Take it. Abel reached out, the weight of it surprising. Warm from Sani's hand, it felt like something older than words. He closed his fingers around it. Thank you. There is one more thing, Sani added. He pointed north. My people camp 3 miles that way. Nita insisted I tell you. If ever you need anything, shelter, aid, food, you come. You will always be welcome. Always. Something tightened in Abel's chest, a kind of emotion with no name. I'll remember that, he said. See that you do. Sani extended his hand. Not ceremonial this time, just one man to another. Abel shook it. Firm, honest, unspoken understanding in the grip. Your daughters, Abel asked. Will they be all right? JC will need time, Sani answered. Weeks, perhaps. But she's young, strong. She'll heal. And Nita, she's already asked when she can resume her training. A faint smile cracked Sani's stone expression. They are survivors, he said, like their father, like the man who gave them a chance. I didn't save them, Abel said. Sani's gaze held him. That is what saving someone means, giving them a chance when they have none left. Sani stepped back, raised a hand in farewell. May your path be clear, Abel Harkin. And yours, Abel replied. Then Sani mounted his horse and rode north without looking back. Within minutes, he was just a silhouette against the falling dusk. Then gone. Nothing left but wind and sky. Abel stood in the ravine, feeling the weight of the carved stone in his palm, the weight of a day that had redrawn his world. He mounted Dusty, turned toward home. The ride back was quiet, peaceful. The stars came out slow, filling the heavens with silver. His barn door still hung open from where the slavers had kicked it in. The grain shed still carried scars from that morning's chaos. But it was still his. Still standing. Still home. He put Dusty in the corral with the other 2 mules. Fed them. Checked their water. The chores felt different now. Familiar, yes, but deeper. He had almost lost all this, and what he'd gained in return couldn't be weighed. Inside the house, he placed the carved stone on the table. In the lamplight, it glowed faintly, a symbol of someone else's legacy, now entrusted to him. He thought about Nita and Jacy, about Sani, about the 5 men who would face justice. He thought about the blood trail that had begun it all, and how it had somehow ended in peace. He had given away the best mule he'd ever raised, for 2 strangers. And instead of punishment, he'd been met with something unexpected. Not gold, not land, something more valuable than either. Respect, trust, the deep knowing that when the moment came, when it mattered most, he had chosen right. He'd seen people not as trouble, but as human beings worth saving. Abel extinguished the lamp and lay down to sleep. Outside, Dusty gave a soft, satisfied bray. Safe. Home. And for the first time in years, Abel Harkin felt like he belonged to something greater than just himself. A land still wild, still cruel, but capable of grace. Because even here, where law came late and mercy came rarely, honor still meant something. And when fear or hatred knocked on your door, you could still choose differently. You could still choose kindness. You could still choose to help. And that, Abel thought, as sleep finally found him, was worth more than any mule.